The first person to hold the door who was not human was a Velthani jurist, and she lasted 2 seconds, and it was the most important 2 seconds in 100,000 years. You know her. She is the one who wrote the best argument anyone ever made against Rhea Maddox. You are not offering them their grief, you are offering them your principle, and you should be very sure which one you are in love with, and Rhea sat with it for 4 days and has never claimed it was wrong. And you know her from the rim over her own homeworld, where she had spent every day since the 19th ship failed reading the names of the human dead into the sky, one crew at a time, out loud, in a voice that had begun to go, because somebody should and nobody had asked her to. Her name was Oriel Vask. She was 634 years old. She had never in her life done a physical thing of any consequence. And when the asking finally came, when a quartermaster from a rock that no longer exists finally, 100,000 years too late, asked the galaxy instead of telling it, Oriel Vask did not deliberate. She had been standing under that hole reading dead human names into it for 90 days. She put down the manifest. She went up in a Kedmer work skiff with a welder she had never met, and she stopped inside the membrane at the rim of the widest wound in the universe, and something enormous and patient and entirely reasonable explained to her, gently, that she had never really been a separate thing. She said no for 2 seconds. 2 seconds. Against a human's 41. It is nothing. It is a rounding error. It is the exact number that 100,000 years of the finest minds in the galaxy had used to prove that her species was useless here, and they were right, and the number is correct, and Nema Salrith had measured it herself and refused to soften it. And in those 2 seconds the wound over the Velthani homeworld got narrower by an amount too small to see. And then a Kedmer took the next 6 seconds. And an Orisk took 9. And somewhere a human took 9, and somewhere else another Velthani took 2, and a Sibran who could not hold for even a full second at all stood on a bridge and called the tempo, and it did not stop. It has not stopped since. That is the whole ending. I am telling you now, at the beginning, because this story has never once cheated you and it is not going to start in the last hour. Nobody wins a battle. Nobody discovers a weapon. The galaxy does not get saved by the unbreakable species. The galaxy gets saved by 2 seconds, passed hand to hand, by everyone, forever. The only thing that ever stood in the way was that nobody had asked. Rhea Maddox had 3 days and no authority and no method, and the method was the problem, and the method had been sitting on every bridge in the galaxy for 100,000 years holding a clipboard. Think about the shape of it. You cannot ask a galaxy. That is not a figure of speech, it is a physical fact, and it has been the load-bearing constraint of this entire story since a message took 9 days to cross to the hearth. There is no faster-than-light communication, because nothing does, because the universe does not permit it. 10,000 worlds across 1,100 light-years. To put a question to all of them and hear back would take centuries. Rhea Maddox had 3 days. The Accord had ruled that galaxy for 100,000 years, and it had ruled it slowly, with couriers, with lag, with decisions that took a decade to arrive, and it had never once seemed strange to anyone, because everyone knew you cannot talk to a galaxy. Except that you can. There has been exactly one way to do it for 100,000 years, and the Accord found it, and catalogued it, and handed it a clipboard, and used it to take minutes. Distance is a property of the surface. Underneath, every point in the galaxy is adjacent. And there are 400 billion Sibren, on 10,000 worlds, with a nerve seated under the surface of the universe, and they are the only living things in creation who are all, always, in the same room. They are not auditors. They were never auditors. They are the only voice this galaxy has ever had, and for 100,000 years they were used to take notes at other people's meetings, and 8 months ago a human being asked them if they wanted their grief back and they said yes and came back whole. Rhea Maddox went to the Sibran and asked for the second thing. She did not order it. She did not have the standing to order anything, and would not have if she had. She asked 400 billion people who had just gotten their worst day back whether they would be willing to carry one more thing, and she told them exactly what it was and exactly what it would cost and exactly what it would mean, and she told them, because she is Rhea Maddox and this is the only thing she has ever actually believed, that they could say no, and that if they said no she would find another way or fail trying, and that either was acceptable. The swarm took 7 hours. And then 400 billion Sibran on 10,000 worlds across 1100 light-years opened their mouths at the same instant, in every language they had ever been made to learn, and asked the galaxy the question that a quartermaster from Anvil had written and an old schoolteacher on Setter's Landing had answered 8 months before anyone thought to read it. It took a handful of seconds to reach everyone alive. It is the first thing that has ever been said to the whole galaxy at once. In 100,000 years of the most sophisticated civilization in recorded history, with its archives and its senate and its 10,000 worlds and its reckoners who could calculate the fall of 9 planets without an error, nobody had ever once said anything to everyone. The Accord had a voice for 100,000 years. It used it to schedule meetings. Nima Salrith was in the room, such as it was, when the swarm agreed to carry it, and she has said that the 7 hours it took were the longest of her long life, longer than the 8 weeks she once spent unable to decide whether she was permitted to forgive a thing that had confessed its own crime to her. She did not know, sitting there, whether 400 billion people who had gotten their grief back a season earlier would say yes to a second unbearable request so soon after the first, and she has admitted, since, that she assumed the answer would be no, and that she had already begun composing, in her head, the version of this story where it was, because a reckoner prepares for the number she is afraid of as carefully as she prepares for the one she wants. She did not need it. When the swarm answered, it did not answer with hesitation. It answered with something closer to relief, and the elder auditor who had once refused to render the thing under the seam as furniture told Nima afterward that the swarm had, in fact, been waiting for someone to ask them this exact question since the day they got their grief back, and that the only reason they had not offered first was that offering, unprompted, would have been its own small version of deciding for someone else what that someone else should carry, and the Sibran, of all the species in this story, had learned that lesson the hardest way there is. They said yes. Not all of them. I want to be exact, because this story has never once flattered anyone and the flattering version is a lie that would undo everything the last few minutes of your life have been about. They did not all say yes. There were worlds that refused outright. There were species who had spent 100,000 years being corrected by the Accord and had no interest in dying for it, and their reasons were good, and Rhea Maddox has defended their right to that answer in every form since with more heat than she has ever defended herself. There were Velthani who pointed out, correctly, that the entire crisis was caused by a human decision to hand a species its grief, and that they were now being asked to pay for it. There were Orisk who asked why the species that had spent this whole war being told it was the only one that mattered was suddenly, at the precise moment the bill arrived, so very interested in sharing. Those were not bad faith questions. Nobody in this story has ever asked a bad faith question. That is the thing about this galaxy that will kill you if you let it. But most of them said yes. Overwhelmingly, immediately, without being asked twice. And the reason is the simplest thing in this entire story, and Nima Salrith, 401 years old, the finest reckoner her species ever produced, who had spent 4 centuries calculating exactly how much force it takes to make anyone fold, says it is the only thing she has learned that she would call wisdom. They said yes because 2 seconds is nothing. That is it. That is the whole mechanism. Nobody was asked to be a hero. Nobody was asked to give up their sky forever, or dissolve, or become the lid, or carry a galaxy. A Velthani was asked for 2 seconds. Once a month. 2 seconds, in a skiff, at a rim, with a welder they had never met, and then they went home and had dinner. The thing under the seam asked the galaxy for 100,000 years of one entity's unbroken attention, and got nothing, because nobody can give that and it never occurred to it to ask for less. Aldous Vane asked 11 billion people for their entire species, forever, at gunpoint, and would have gotten it, and it would have produced 4%. Rhea Maddox asked everybody for 2 seconds. And the arithmetic, Nima ran it in 4 minutes, and then ran it 11 more times because she could not believe a number had finally closed. The arithmetic is not close. It is not even interesting. There are, by the Accord's own 100,000-year census, somewhere on the order of 7 trillion thinking beings in this galaxy. 2 seconds each, once a month, relayed without a gap, produces more stitch seconds in a day than every human being who has ever lived could produce in 1,300 years. Total demand, rising, without limit. Total supply, also, as of a handful of seconds ago, without limit. The door was never too heavy. It was just being held by one thing, and then by one species, and both of those were somebody's decision, made kindly, by the wisest person in the room, on everyone else's behalf. There is a version of this reveal that plays as triumph, and Nima Salrith has refused, every time she is asked, to let it be told that way. We did not discover something clever, she says. We discovered that we had been asking the wrong question for 100,000 years, which is not a triumph, it is an indictment, and it happens to also be survivable. Those are different things, and I would like people to stop congratulating the galaxy for the second one as though it were the first. She has pointed out, more than once, that the arithmetic of 2 seconds was always true. It did not become true the week Rhea Maddox thought of it. A Velthani could always have held for 2 seconds. A trillion small kindnesses could always have relayed a burden nobody was ever meant to carry alone. The only thing that changed, in the entire history of this catastrophe, is that someone finally stood in the middle of the wreckage and asked instead of decided, and Nima Salrith, 401 years old, says that the smallness of that difference is the whole of what she has learned in a very long life, and that she resents, slightly, how simple it turned out to be. I am going to describe what it looks like now, because there has never been anything like it and there will never be anything like it again, and because 400 billion people conduct it and not one of them has ever been thanked. It looks like breathing. Across 1100 light-years, at 2011 wounds in the floor of the world, there are skiffs. Not warships. Warships were the wrong idea, warships were the last thing the galaxy tried before it thought of the right thing. Skiffs, small, ugly, cheap, welded by the 10,000 in yards that used to build lance arrays, each one carrying 4 to 8 people who are not soldiers and have had 2 days of training and will be home by evening. And they go up in shifts. A skiff stops inside the membrane at the rim. Somebody holds 2 seconds, or 6, or 9, or 41 if they are human and it is very bad and they have decided something. And in the last quarter second before they let go, another skiff is already there, already stopped, already holding, because a Sibran on a bridge 1,000 light-years away felt the first one starting to agree with it and called the change, and the second skiff moved before the first one knew it was finished. There is never a gap. That is the entire art. 2 seconds means nothing if there is a gap, the wound reopens in the gap and everything before it is wasted. The relay is not about strength and it is not about courage and it has nothing whatsoever to do with the yield. It is about timing, across 1100 light-years, at a precision of quarter seconds, between 7 trillion beings who cannot see each other and will never meet. I want to tell you what it is actually like inside one of those skiffs, on an ordinary rim, on an ordinary day, because the widest one gets all the recordings and most of the relay is not the widest one. It is a Kedmer cargo hauler retrofitted in 12 days over a spill above a fishing colony nobody outside 3 systems has heard of. It is a mother and her grown son from a core world taking alternating shifts because the roster clerk did not have the heart to split them up. It is an Orisk retiree who came out of a comfortable posting because a nephew asked him to and he found, to his own visible confusion, that he did not mind. There is a checklist taped to the inside of every skiff's hatch, the same checklist on every rim, in 19 languages stacked one under the other, and the last line on it, added by a Kedmer clerk nobody has ever been able to identify and now printed on every skiff in the galaxy without anyone voting on it, reads simply, "You will not be the only one. Look for the next ship before you go under." It is already there. There is a sound, if you can call it that every skiff crew learns to listen for in the last half second before their own turn, and it is not a sound at all, not in any sense a human ear would recognize, but every crew who has held describes it the same way regardless of species, which is itself the strangest piece of data Nima has ever collected, a kind of settling, a felt certainty that the next hands are already in place, arriving not as information but as permission. Vane's doctrine called it the handoff and left it at that, a clean word for a clean mechanism, but the crews who actually fly the rims call it something else, unofficially, on every world where the relay runs, in every one of the 10,000 languages this galaxy still speaks. They call it the next one. You do not let go because you are done. You let go because you can feel the next one, and in the months the relay has run since, the feeling has never once been wrong. And there is exactly one species in creation that can do that. The Sibran cannot hold 0.6 of a second, and they are gone, they have a nerve down there already and the boundary was never fully theirs. By every measure this war has, they are the most useless species in the galaxy. They were useless when they were auditors and they are useless on a rim. They are also the only thing that is everywhere at once, and the relay is 100,000 years long and cannot afford one gap, and so 400 billion Sibrin conduct it. All of it. Every rim, every skiff, every shift change, everywhere, simultaneously, forever, a galaxy-wide metronome made of the one species that cannot fight, keeping 7 trillion strangers in time to a quarter of a second. Nima Salrith has said that if there is a single image she wants to survive her, it is this. The Accord spent 100,000 years using the only voice in the galaxy to schedule its own meetings, and it turned out that voice was a heartbeat, and it had been waiting 100 millennia for somebody to give it something worth keeping time for. And they got their grief back first. That is the part Rhea will not let anyone leave out. They could not have done this before. A species with a hole in it and no idea why cannot keep time for a galaxy. They had to be whole first, and being whole cost them the worst 13 hours in the history of anything, and they chose it, because somebody finally asked. The most right thing anyone ever did opened the door. And it is also the only reason the door can be held. Both of those are true. Rhea Maddox has stopped trying to make them into one sentence. Understand that the widest one is the only rim this story has time to walk you along, and that this is, in its own small way, exactly the mistake the schoolteacher spent 8 months trying to correct. So before the widest one closes, I want to take you somewhere else, briefly, because 2011 other wounds closed during the same 4 days, in places nobody will ever make a recording about, and they mattered exactly as much. On a Kedmer shipping lane 3 systems from anywhere important, a spill the width of a house opened over an empty cargo route and was gone in 7 minutes. Closed by a rotating crew of 6 retired dockworkers who had spent the last 8 months training on a decommissioned tug because they were too old, by every doctrine Vane had ever written, to be sent anywhere that mattered more. Nobody sent them a citation. Nobody has ever recorded their names outside a shift log. They have said, when asked, that this was correct, and that a species which starts keeping score of who saved which world is a species that has already forgotten what it just built. On an Orisk military world that had spent the whole war insisting, formally and often, that it did not need human doctrine to know how to fight, a garrison commander named Torvith Saravan took the first Orisk-only rim of the relay and held it clean for the full 4 days without a single human aboard, not out of pride, he said afterward, but because he had watched Asen Carr's rotation doctrine work on the widest one and wanted to know, honestly, whether an Orisk crew alone could hold it, and the answer was yes, slightly worse than a mixed crew and considerably better than anyone in his own high command had believed possible a season earlier. He filed the data without comment. Creel read it and had it distributed, unedited, to every Orisk officer left in the fleet, because he had learned a long time ago that pride handled honestly is not the same thing as pride indulged. And on Bell Hollow, a grey world with nothing at stake in this particular fight, because there was no spill anywhere near it and never had been, Priya organized a rotation anyway, not to hold anything, there was nothing local to hold, but to answer letters, because somebody had to keep doing the part of this war that was not on a rim, and she had decided that was hers. 9 Anvil children and a growing number of neighbors sat at her kitchen table in shifts of their own devising, reading mail addressed to a woman who was 3 days from a decision that would end the war, and writing back in her name and their own, because the correspondence, Priya said, was also a kind of holding, and somebody should mind it while the captain was busy. There was, in those 4 days, exactly one rim that failed entirely, and I want to tell you about it, because a story that only shows you the closures is telling half a truth. A spill above a Kedmer mining platform on the edge of the old frontier widened past the point any crew could answer it, not through anyone's failure, but because the platform sat at the end of a relay chain 3 hops long and the 3rd hop never arrived. The Sibrin meant to carry that tempo was already committed elsewhere, on a rim that had, in the moment of choosing, more people under it. The platform's own crew held as long as any crew has ever held without relay support, unassisted, trading 9-second shifts without a call to tell them when, guessing at the tempo from the shape of the wound itself, and it was not enough, and 106 people are gone, and there is no version of this story where that is made to mean something it does not mean. Nima Salrith has said, of that platform, that it is the number she thinks about more than any other from the entire war, because it is the number that proves the relay is not magic. It is triage, done honestly, at a scale nobody has ever had to do it at before, and triage costs exactly what triage has always cost, and the honesty is in saying so rather than in pretending the relay saved everyone, because it did not, and it was never going to, and Rhea Maddox would rather you know that than feel better about the ending. They closed it on the fourth day, and I want to walk you along the rim, because the recordings show a traffic jam and the truth is the largest thing our species has ever been part of. 4,000 skiffs at the widest wound in the universe, and not one of them crewed by a single species. That was Creel's doing, and it may be the best order he gave in the whole of this war. He worked out within an hour of the asking that a mixed crew holds longer than a pure one, not because of biology, because of shame, which is the least dignified and most reliable force in the galaxy. A Velthani alone in a skiff holds for 2 seconds. A Velthani in a skiff with a human who is going to hold for 9 holds for 2.5, every time, and nobody has ever been able to make them stop. Do not tell them, Creel said, when the data came back. Do not ever tell them. Let them find out at the rim. So the skiffs went up mixed. Oriel Vask, 634 years old, who had never done a physical thing of consequence, in a work skiff with a Kedmer welder and an Orisk who had spent 40 years in a fleet that had once been ordered to destroy Anvil, and a 19-year-old human from a fishing world who had 2 days of training and would be home by evening. And a Sibren, on the bridge of the ridgeline, holding station at the widest one exactly where the corvette had held for the whole of the siege before it, calling every shift change on that rim to the quarter-second, and it did not matter, down where the calls were actually made, whether the next relay hop was on the same hull or on the far side of the galaxy. The first day was the worst by every measure that matters. The relay was new. Nobody had ever coordinated 7 trillion beings across a rotation before, and the first hours were ragged in a way that terrified everyone who watched the telemetry, because a relay that is ragged is a relay with gaps in it, and a gap is where the wound remembers it is still open. Ada Fenimore Sibren, calling the widest one's north face from the ridgeline, spent the first 6 hours of the relay doing something no swarm member had ever attempted, holding the tempo not for one bridge but for a dozen skiffs at once, a Velthani Kedmer human rotation stacked 3 deep, because the newer, smaller relay nodes had not yet learned the pattern and she had. She did not sleep, in the sense that a Sibren sleeps. She simply did not stop, for 6 hours, until 2 more swarm members arrived from a rim that had gone quiet and could spare them, and only then did she let the pattern hand off, and Ada Fenimore has said that when the handoff happened, the Sibren said 4 words on the open channel before disengaging, and the 4 words were, I did not want to. Tail Marsh flew the north face for the whole of the first day, because he had asked to, and because nobody left with the standing to refuse him wanted to be the one who said the man with the most hours of holding in galactic history should sit this one out. He took 19 rotations before the day ended, more than any human on that rim, and when a young Velthani volunteer in his 4th skiff asked him, between shifts, whether it got easier, Tail Marsh told her the only thing he has ever told anyone who asked him that question honestly. No, he said. It gets more familiar. Those aren't the same. Familiar just means you know exactly how bad it's going to be before it starts, and you go anyway, and I don't have a better word for what that is than the one we've been using this whole war. She held for 2.5 seconds on her next turn, half a second longer than the table said she should, and did not mention it to anyone, because by the first day nobody was keeping that particular tally out loud anymore. The second day, the rim found its rhythm, and rhythm is a strange word to use about something this grim, but it is the correct one. The relay stopped feeling like an emergency and started feeling like a shift, which everyone who has ever worked a hard job will recognize as the moment a crisis becomes survivable, not because it got easier, but because the body learned where to put the fear so it stopped being in the way. Torvith Wren, the yard supervisor who had flown unfinished hulls into a backslide 2 months earlier, was there, on the widest one now, in a skiff with a Velthani archivist and 2 humans he had never met before that morning, and he said afterward that the second day was the first time in the entire war he had felt, even briefly, that the species were actually fighting the same fight instead of 4 different fights that happened to share a battlefield. It was also the day the relay lost its youngest crew, and I am going to tell you about it plainly, because Rhea Maddox has insisted, every time this story is told, that the second day not be remembered only as the good one. A skiff crewed by 2 Kedmer apprentices and a Velthani student, none of them older than the war itself, took a routine turn at the low quarter during what should have been an uneventful hour. The tempo call came a half-second late, not because the Sibren calling it made an error, but because a second, smaller flicker opened 40 meters from the first and split her attention for the fraction of a second that mattered. All 3 held their 9 and 6 and 2 respectively and let go together, the way crews do, and there is a stitch in the rim now with 3 names on it instead of 1, in 3 different alphabets, and the Sibren who called that tempo asked to be reassigned afterward, not out of fault. Everyone was clear that there was no fault, but because she said she needed, for a while, to call a tempo for a rim where nobody young was standing. The 3rd day, the wound tried something it had not tried before, and it is the closest this siege ever came to catastrophe. A section of the rim 700 meters wide went ragged all at once, not widening exactly, but flickering, the boundary failing and half recovering and failing again faster than any doctrine had a name for, and for 8 minutes the relay could not find a stable tempo anywhere along that stretch. 3 skiffs were lost in the flickering, cleanly, the way they are always lost, the running lights burning for a second and a half with nobody left to see them. And then a Sibren nobody had ever heard of before that day, a young auditor serving her first rotation on a border world tender, did the thing that ended it. She stopped calling the tempo for her own section and started calling it for the flickering instead, treating the unstable boundary itself as a rhythm to be matched rather than a rim to be defended, a distinction Nima Salrath would spend the rest of her life trying to explain to people who had not been there and would later admit she still could not fully explain to herself. The flickering steadied. The relay held. Nobody gave that auditor a citation either, because by the 3rd day nobody was giving out citations anymore. They had stopped meaning anything the moment everyone understood that everyone was doing this. Oriel Vask flew 3 shifts through the worst of the 3rd day's flickering, and she has said, in the one interview she has ever given about it, that the strangest part was not the fear. It was how ordinary the fear became. A jurist who had spent 6 centuries deciding matters of law with the confidence of someone who believed every question had a correct answer waiting to be found herself, at the rim, simply repeating a single sentence to herself between shifts, over and over, not as a prayer, she was careful to specify, because she does not believe in anything that would receive one, but as a kind of ballast. I said no once already. I know how. She has said that sentence is the truest thing she has ever written, in any of the arguments that made her famous, and that a court of law took her 40 years to learn what a skiff taught her in 9 seconds. The 4th day, at 0400 hours, the widest wound in the universe simply was not there anymore, and the sky over the Velfani homeworld was just sky, and 40 billion people who had lived under a hole for 90 days looked up at nothing, and Oriel Vask, who had read the names of the human dead into that sky every day for 3 months, was in a skiff at the rim when it closed and did not notice, because she was busy holding. There is no moment of triumph. There is no shot to describe. They went up in waves for 4 days. 76,000 skiffs. 400,000 people. 2 seconds and 6 seconds and 9 seconds, over and over, day and night, a wound 11 kilometers wide getting narrower by amounts nobody could see, and the whole thing keeping perfect time to a metronome made of the species the Accord had handed a clipboard. They lost 382 people over those 4 days. They had lost 19 ships on the first day of the old way, and the old way was going to take 6 years and produce 4%. 382, and 4 days. That is the difference between a galaxy that asks and a galaxy that does not. That is the whole cost of 100,000 years of somebody deciding, kindly, that the rest of us could not be trusted with the question. There is one more thing, and it is the reason Nima Salrath has never been able to talk about the 4th day without stopping. You will remember, from the very beginning of all this, that when the galaxy first got a conversation with the thing under the seam, bought with a man's dissolution, rendered by 19 translators over 9 weeks, a dockhand on Bell Hollow asked the question nobody else had thought of. Not what it needs. What it wants. And the answer came back and Nima Salrath would not discuss it, and the Sibren who carried it asked never to be asked again, and it has sat under this entire story like a stone. Here it is. It said, I would like to look away. For 1 second. I have never seen anything. That is what it wanted. 100,000 years, and the oldest thing in the galaxy, holding a door shut by refusing without interruption to look away from it, asked for 1 second of looking at something else. Not rest. Not relief. Not to be free. 1 second. It had never seen the galaxy it was holding the door for. It had held that door since before the galaxy was this shape and it had spent the entire time facing the other way. That is why Nima would not discuss it. Not because it was unbearable. Because she had spent a season convicting it of the only sin in this story, of deciding, alone, that 400 billion people could not carry their own grief, and she had been right, and she had never once stopped to ask what kind of thing does that. A thing that has never seen anything. A thing whose entire experience of existence is one closed door and the sound of a galaxy walking past it. Of course it decided for them. It had never in 100,000 years watched a single person decide anything for themselves. It did not know that was a thing that could happen. It had nothing to go on. On the fourth day, when the widest wound closed and the relay took the rim, Rhea Maddox sent it a message through 400 billion Sibren. 9 words. She wrote them herself and did not consult anyone. She wrote, "We have it. Look at whatever you want. Take longer." And the oldest thing in creation, for the first time since before this galaxy had its current shape, looked away from the door. Nobody knows what it saw. It has not said. It looked away for 4 seconds, for, not 1, and Nima says the extra 3 are the most extravagant thing that has ever happened, and then it took the door back, because it is what it is, and it has been holding ever since, alongside the relay, in shifts, with 7 trillion strangers. But the Sibren felt what came through the nerve in those 4 seconds. All of them. And they will not render it, and they have asked never to be asked, and the only thing any of them will say, and 400 billion of them say exactly this, in exactly these words, which is not a translation artifact, they simply all say it, is. It did not look at the galaxy. It looked at us. Aldous Vane was wrong for the first time in his life, and he took it perfectly, and that is the last horror of this story. He never conscripted anyone. The 3 days ran out and the asking had already happened and the relay was already up, and Vane looked at Nima's new arithmetic, the one that closed, and read it in 6 minutes and said, "Well. There it is," and cancelled the plan, and went back to the rim and held for 9 seconds, over and over, for 4 days, like everybody else. Rhea Maddox found him afterward. He was sitting alone in a hangar on a skiff carrier, and the war was over, and he was 44 years old and completely healthy and had nothing whatsoever to do. "You were right," he said. "For the record. You should hear it from me. I've spent my whole life being right about the arithmetic and wrong about the question, and I never once noticed there was a difference." He was not bitter. He has never been bitter. "The schoolteacher beat me. A woman who teaches 9-year-olds on a world I couldn't find on a chart. She had it in the first week. She did. Because she asked how many of us there are, and I asked how much I could spend." He looked at his hands. "That's it, isn't it? That's the whole difference. That's Tessely Crossing and the fire order and all of it. I have never once in my life asked how many. I only ever asked how much." And then Aldous Vane said the thing that Rhea Maddox has never repeated to anyone except Nima Salrath, at 3 in the morning, in a galley, which is where every real conversation in this story has happened. "Let me hold 41, he said. "There are 2,000 rims. Let me be a stitch. I would like to be useful, Captain, and I would like it to be finished, and I would like it to be finished by something I did." And Rhea Maddox said no. She said it immediately and she has never wavered and she has never explained it to his satisfaction, and here is why, and it is close to the last thing this season has to say. "That's the thing we just abolished," she told him. "Nobody spends themselves any more. Nobody gets to be the one who carries it so the rest of us don't have to. That was the whole sickness, Aldous. That's what the thing under the seam did for 100,000 years and that's what Sorrow did and that's what Vandermeer did and that's what you wanted to do to 11 billion people last week." She sat down across from him. "You don't get to dissolve into a hole and make it mean something. You have to hold 2 seconds like everybody else and then go home and have dinner and be a person for the next 40 years, and it's going to be unbearable, and that's the price. That's not mercy." "No," said Rhea Maddox. "It's just fair. Mercy is what we've been doing to each other for 100,000 years and look at it." He looked at her for a long time after that, and something in his face changed that she has never been able to fully describe, not because it was dramatic, but because it was the opposite of dramatic, a very small settling, the kind of expression a person wears when a thing they suspected about themselves has finally been said out loud by somebody else and confirmed. "I used to think the worst thing that could happen to me was losing," he said. "Tessely Crossing taught me that wasn't true. The worst thing that can happen to you is winning at something you shouldn't have been fighting for in the first place, and then having to live in the world you built. I have done that twice now. I would like it, very much, if I never did it a third time. He stood up to leave, and at the hangar door he stopped, and added, without turning around, "For what it's worth, Captain, I am glad you said no. I would not have believed that about myself a year ago." So Aldous Vane is still here. He is a person now, which is the only punishment anyone ever devised that fits him, and there is nothing left in this galaxy that it is correct to point him at, and he told Rhea Maddox that this would be a problem, and he was right about that too, and nobody has solved it, and it is not solved as I speak. Davin Creel is, as far as anyone can determine, exactly where he has always been, which is wherever the lights need someone to keep them on. He gave the order that put mixed crews on every skiff in the relay, and it held, and he went back to the unglamorous work of running whatever the Accord has become, a job he has now held longer than anyone held the Accord itself in its final century, and he has said, when people ask him what comes next for him personally, that the question does not interest him, because there has never once in this story been a next for Davin Creel that was about Davin Creel, and he sees no reason to start looking for one now that the war is over. Rhea Maddox asked him once, not long after the widest one closed, whether he ever regretted standing aside at the end of Anvil instead of fighting on, since standing aside had cost him a command and a career and very nearly his life, and had bought him nothing he could point to the way a victory can be pointed to. Creel considered the question with the same unhurried honesty he gives every question, and said that he did not, because the alternative was a version of himself who kept fighting a war he had already understood could not be won on the terms he had been given, and he had decided, standing on that bridge, that he would rather be the officer who admitted the terms were wrong than the one who died still insisting they were right. "You did the same thing 4 separate times," he told her, "and they wrote songs about you for it. I did it once, and mostly what I got was a demotion and 40 years of paperwork. I have made my peace with the difference. Somebody has to do the paperwork, Captain. It might as well be the one who already knows what happens when nobody does. So that is Season 1, and the galaxy is still here, and I want to tell you exactly what happened, plainly, because 100,000 years of this story went wrong precisely because somebody decided the plain version was too much for people. 100,000 years ago something at the bottom of everything closed a door and has been holding it ever since by refusing to look away, and it has never seen anything, and it got frightened for us and whispered be quiet, and every civilization that heard it built a machine out of the whisper and never asked why. The Accord became a lid. The vigil burned itself. 100 millennia of the finest minds in creation, all of them kind, all of them right about the facts, every single one of them deciding alone that the rest of us could not carry the truth. And a quartermaster from a rock called Anvil, who never wanted to command anything larger than a loading dock, who lost her world and believed for 11 days that she had lost her daughter, who was given the largest decision in history 4 separate times and refused every one of them, did exactly one thing, over and over, for 3 years, in the face of everyone. She told people the truth and asked them what they thought. That is all. That is the entire content of it. She was not the strongest or the wisest or the most gifted person in this story, she was not close. Nema Salrath is the finest mind in the galaxy. Aldous Vane was never once wrong. Elon Sorrow had more love and more authority and more wisdom than Rhea Maddox will ever have, and he stood exactly where she stood and he made the other choice, and it cost 10,000 years and 60,000 people on a world that is now a clean absence with the stars shining through it. And the thing that saved the galaxy was not humanity's unbreakability. Understand that, because everyone got it wrong, including us, especially us, for the entire length of this story. 41 seconds against 2. We spent 3 years being told we were the only ones who mattered and we believed it, and it very nearly killed everything, because a species that thinks it is the only one who can carry the world will never think to ask anyone to help. We were not the strongest. We were the longest. Nobody checked the difference. Our gift was never the 41 seconds. Our gift was that we were the only ones stupid enough and stubborn enough and lonely enough to ask everybody else. There are 7 trillion of us now, and I mean that word, and every species in this galaxy has started meaning it, and nobody has voted on it or ratified it or written it down. There are 2011 rims and a relay that has not gapped once in 10 months, kept in time to a quarter second by 400 billion Sibren who spent 100,000 years holding a clipboard and got their grief back and became a heartbeat. Oriel Vask holds for 2 seconds, once a month, and reads names the rest of the time. A 19-year-old from a fishing world holds for 9 and is home by evening. Nell Maddox is 11, and she asked her mother whether she could hold when she turns 14, and her mother said yes, and did not enjoy saying it, and said it anyway, because the alternative is deciding for her. And on a grey world called Bell Hollow, in a house belonging to a woman named Priya, Rhea Maddox is answering her mail. All of it, now. Every letter. Badly and slowly and by hand, with a stack that will outlive her, because she read 8 months of an old schoolteacher asking the only question that mattered and did not hear it, and she has decided that this will not happen twice, and it is the only penance she has ever accepted. The door is held. It will be held forever, by everybody, 2 seconds at a time. And nobody, not Rhea Maddox, not Nima Salrath, not the 400 billion Sibran with a nerve seated under the surface of the universe, not one of the 7 trillion beings currently taking a shift on a rim somewhere in the dark, nobody has ever been told what is behind it. It has never said. Not once. Not in the conversation that cost Oral Vandermeer everything, not in 9 weeks of 19 translators, not on the 4th day when it looked away for 4 seconds and saw us. Nima Salrath asked it, on the last day, through the swarm. She asked it plainly, the way she has learned to ask things. She said, "What are we holding?" And the oldest thing in the galaxy, which has never lied, which confessed its only crime unprompted, which asked for 1 second of looking and took 4, the thing we are now holding a door shut with, forever, in shifts, alongside every living being in creation. It did not answer.